The morning of June 19th, 1944, Commander Tadashi Kaneko sat in the intelligence office of the Combined Fleet Headquarters at Hashirajima Anchorage, staring at reconnaissance photographs that refused to make sense. Spread across his desk were grainy images of American carrier formations photographed 3 days earlier during operations near Saipan. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He counted the flight decks again. 24 Essex-class carriers, 24 identical silhouettes, each displacing 27,500 tons, each carrying nearly 100 aircraft. He set down his pencil and reached for a different folder, one containing the complete production history of Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carriers. Every carrier Japan had built, converted, or commissioned since Hosho entered service in 1922. The list was comprehensive, meticulously maintained. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers, seaplane tenders converted to carry aircraft, submarine tenders transformed into makeshift flight decks, even battleships modified with flight decks. Every vessel that had ever launched an aircraft for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The total, counted 3 separate times to ensure accuracy, came to 25. In the entire history of Japanese naval aviation, stretching back over 2 decades of innovation, industrial effort, and military necessity, the Empire of Japan had produced exactly 25 aircraft carriers. The Americans had matched that number with a single class of ship, and they had done it in 3 years. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Kaneko understood, in that moment of crystalline clarity, what analysts throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy were only beginning to grasp. The Americans hadn't just recovered from Pearl Harbor. They hadn't merely rebuilt their carrier force. They had manufactured an entirely new category of naval warfare, powered by industrial capacity that existed on a scale Japan couldn't comprehend. The arithmetic was devastating. 24 Essex carriers equaled Japan's entire carrier production history, but the Americans also had 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls and commissioned in 1943. They had dozens of escort carriers. They had carriers under construction, in fitting out, completing sea trials. The actual American carrier count in mid-1944 approached 60 operational flight decks. Japan possessed 4 operational carriers remaining from the 25 built over 22 years. The rest lay at the bottom of the Pacific, victims of battles at Coral Sea, Midway, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea. Each loss had been catastrophic not just for the ship, but for the irreplaceable aircrew, the maintenance personnel, the organizational knowledge that sank with every carrier. And replacement was impossible. Japan's shipyards were overwhelmed, its resources depleted, its industrial capacity strained to breaking. The Americans were adding a new Essex carrier every 2 months. To understand how this disparity became possible, how Japanese intelligence officers could find themselves counting enemy carriers that outnumbered their own navy's entire historical production, requires examining 2 parallel stories. The first is the story of American industrial mobilization, the transformation of a peacetime economy into history's most formidable military manufacturing machine. The second is the story of Japanese limitations, the constraints of island geography, resource scarcity, and industrial infrastructure that made matching American production not merely difficult, but physically impossible. Both stories began long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The Essex-class carrier represented American naval aviation's maturation, the culmination of 2 decades of carrier development freed from treaty restrictions. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had limited carrier tonnage, forcing navies to make compromises between size, speed, protection, and aircraft capacity. When that treaty system collapsed in 1936, American naval architects finally received freedom to design the carrier they'd always wanted. Design work began in earnest in 1939 under Commander Leslie Knisken at the Bureau of Ships. The specifications were ambitious. Displacement of 27,000 tons, speed over 32 knots, armor protection against bombs and torpedoes, capacity for 90 aircraft with room for more, the longest flight deck physically possible, while still fitting through the Panama Canal locks, because American naval strategy required the ability to transfer ships rapidly between Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The first orders came in July 1940, months before Pearl Harbor, 3 carriers, to be built by Newport News Shipbuilding. Then came 10 more orders in August 1942, as the scale of Pacific War requirements became clear. Then 3 more in June 1943. By the time construction peaked, contracts had been awarded to 4 major shipyards across 3 states: Newport News in Virginia, Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard in Massachusetts, Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, Philadelphia Navy Yard, and Norfolk Navy Yard. The construction method represented American mass production expertise applied to warship building. Earlier, carriers like Yorktown and Enterprise had required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning, built largely as individual projects with custom-fitted components. The Essex-class adopted simplified construction techniques, standardized parts, modular assembly, prefabricated sections, built simultaneously at different locations, and brought together for final assembly. USS Essex, the lead ship, was laid down April 28, 1941. She commissioned December 31, 1942. 20 months from keel to completion. USS Franklin, built at Newport News, completed in just 14 months. The average construction time across the class was 16 to 20 months. The shipyards achieved this pace through 24-hour operations, 3 shifts of workers, women joining the workforce in unprecedented numbers, welding techniques replacing older riveting methods, rationalized workflows that treated carrier construction like automotive assembly. Newport News Shipbuilding employed over 30,000 workers at peak production. They built 7 Essex carriers simultaneously at various stages of construction. The Quincy Yard built 4, Brooklyn Navy Yard built 3. Philadelphia and Norfolk yards each contributed multiple hulls. The logistical coordination was staggering. Armor plate from Bethlehem Steel's Pennsylvania mills, turbines and reduction gearing from General Electric plants, boilers from Babcock and Wilcox facilities, aviation gasoline systems, fire suppression equipment, radar sets, radio equipment, anti-aircraft directors, arresting gear, catapults, all from specialized manufacturers coordinated through the Bureau of Ships. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex carriers had joined the fleet. By the end of 1944, 17 were operational. By war's end in August 1945, 24 Essex-class carriers had been completed and commissioned, with several more under construction subsequently cancelled. Every 2 months, another 30,000-ton carrier slid down the ways, completed its trials, worked up its crew, and joined the Pacific Fleet. Every 2 months, another 90 aircraft, another 3,000 sailors, another mobile airfield, capable of projecting American power across thousands of miles of ocean. Growing horror. Japanese intelligence maintained detailed files on American carrier construction. Their attachés in neutral countries gathered technical publications. Their agents collected information from maritime insurance records, shipping manifests, public statements by American politicians. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed American ports when possible, though such overflights became increasingly dangerous as American defenses strengthened. By 1944, submarine reconnaissance provided occasional glimpses of American naval concentrations, though even those missions were extraordinarily hazardous. What they observed contradicted everything Japanese naval planning had assumed about American industrial capacity and national will. Pre-war Japanese strategy had depended on several key assumptions. First, that a devastating surprise attack would cripple American Pacific naval power for at least 18 months, providing time to establish a defensive perimeter. Second, that American public opinion would not support a long Pacific War, especially if Japan made conquest sufficiently costly. Third, that American industrial capacity, while large, could not simultaneously support major operations in both Atlantic and Pacific theaters while also supplying Britain and the Soviet Union. All three assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The Pearl Harbor attack, while tactically successful, missed the American carriers entirely. Yorktown, Enterprise, and Lexington were all at sea. This chance absence preserved American carrier aviation's offensive capability. Even the battleships, which seemed totally destroyed, proved salvageable. 6 of the 8 battleships damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor returned to service. American determination to continue the war never wavered, and American industrial capacity exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war estimates. The United States didn't choose between theaters. It fought everywhere simultaneously, building enough equipment not just for American forces but for Allied nations as well. Japanese planners had fundamentally misunderstood American economic potential. They calculated industrial capacity based on peacetime production figures, failing to account for the massive surge capability that could be achieved through mobilization. They underestimated American raw material access. They didn't comprehend American manufacturing culture, the expertise in mass production, the flexibility to retool factories, the ability to train workers rapidly. Most critically, they failed to grasp the compounding effect of superior logistics. American carriers operated with extensive logistical support. Service Squadron 10, attached to the Fast Carrier Task Force, included floating dry docks, repair ships, oilers, ammunition vessels, provision ships, hospital ships, tenders, tugs, crane barges. This fleet within a fleet enabled carriers damaged in combat to receive sophisticated repairs at forward anchorages like Ulithi Atoll, getting ships back into action in weeks rather than months. Japan possessed nothing comparable. Damaged Japanese carriers had to return to major naval bases for repair. This meant longer transit times, longer repair times, longer absences from operations. Carriers the Japanese believed they had sunk kept reappearing in American task forces, repairs completed at sea or at forward bases, ready for combat again. The industrial disparity extended beyond carriers themselves to every aspect of carrier operations: aircraft production, aircrew training, aviation fuel supply, spare parts manufacture, maintenance equipment, all areas where American capacity overwhelmed Japanese resources. American aircraft manufacturers produced over 300,000 military aircraft during the war years. Japanese production peaked at 28,000 annually. American pilot training programs graduated thousands of qualified carrier aviators yearly. Japanese training, always more restrictive and time-consuming, couldn't replace losses after Midway's devastating aircrew casualties. American ships carried extensive spare parts inventories and had specialized repair personnel aboard. Japanese carriers operated with minimal spare parts, depending on shore facilities for major maintenance. Every advantage compounded. Better trained American pilots flying more numerous, better maintained aircraft from more numerous carriers, supported by superior logistics, created a force multiplier that Japanese planning hadn't anticipated and Japanese resources couldn't match. By mid-1944, Japanese carrier aviation existed in name only. The mobile fleet assembled for the Philippine Sea contained 9 carriers, the largest concentration Japan would field since Midway, but those 9 carriers embarked only 430 aircraft total, many flown by partially trained pilots. The American Fifth Fleet opposing them deployed 15 carriers carrying 900 aircraft flown by veteran crews. The battle, which American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. 3 carriers sunk, including the brand-new armored Taiho, 400 aircraft lost, irreplaceable pilots killed. The surviving carriers withdrew, their effectiveness permanently broken, and still the Essex carriers kept coming, USS Shangri-La, completing in September 1944, USS Bonhomme Richard, joining the fleet in November 1944, USS Lake Champlain, Tarawa, Kearsarge, all commissioning in 1945, in time for the final operations against the Japanese home islands. Japanese intelligence officers counting these ships understood their significance. Every new Essex represented industrial capacity Japan simply didn't possess. Even if Japanese shipyards had unlimited time, unlimited resources, unlimited workers, they couldn't match American production rates. The limitations were fundamental, rooted in geography, raw material access, industrial infrastructure, manufacturing culture, shipyard capacity. Japan is an island nation with limited natural resources. It imported most strategic materials: oil, iron ore, bauxite, rubber, coal. These imports traveled by sea across distances, increasingly dominated by American submarines. By 1944, American submarine warfare had devastated Japanese merchant shipping. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies, ore carriers from Southeast Asia, all ran gauntlets of American submarines that grew more deadly as sonar improved. Tactics evolved. Torpedoes became more reliable. Without resources, Japanese industry ground toward paralysis. Steel production declined. Aluminum became scarce. Aviation fuel supplies dwindled. Synthetic rubber programs couldn't compensate for lost natural rubber imports. The industrial base that needed to produce carriers lacked the materials to do so. Human resources proved equally limiting. Japan's population in 1944 was 70 million. America's population exceeded 140 million. The pool of potential workers, soldiers, sailors, pilots was proportionally larger. American women entered the workforce in massive numbers, a social transformation Japan couldn't or wouldn't replicate to the same degree. The shipyard workers building Essex carriers in 1944 included thousands of women welders, electricians, fitters, workers in roles that had been exclusively male in peacetime. Shipyard capacity imposed physical limits. Japan had 4 major naval shipyards capable of building fleet carriers: Kure, Sasebo, Yokosuka, and Nagasaki. These facilities were already overwhelmed with existing commitments: damaged warships requiring repair, submarine construction, destroyer production, cruiser completion, all competed for limited dry dock space and skilled workers. Adding carrier construction meant reducing other production. The Americans built Essex carriers at 6 different shipyards simultaneously, while also building battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, escort carriers, landing craft, merchant ships. The scale was incomprehensible. When Essex was laid down in April 1941, 5 more Essex keels followed that same year. By December 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, 6 Essex carriers were under construction simultaneously at 3 different shipyards. Japanese planners examining these figures understood mathematical reality. Even in the hypothetical scenario where Japan had the resources, the workers, the time to match American construction, the shipyard capacity didn't exist. Building even one Essex-sized carrier required massive infrastructure. Building 24 required infrastructure Japan simply didn't have and couldn't create quickly enough to matter. The Essex carriers represented not just American naval power, but American economic might, the mobilization of a continental nation's industrial capacity toward a single goal, projecting military force across the Pacific. Every carrier embodied thousands of tons of steel, thousands of specialized components, thousands of trained workers, millions of hours of labor, all coordinated through logistics networks that spanned the continent. Japan had built 25 carriers total in its entire naval history. And they did it while simultaneously fighting major naval campaigns, supporting ground operations, supplying allies, building dozens of other warship types, manufacturing hundreds of thousands of aircraft, training hundreds of thousands of personnel. The revelation wasn't just that America could build carriers faster. It was that American industrial capacity operated on a fundamentally different scale, a scale Japanese planners had failed to comprehend in 1941 when they launched the war. Commander Kaneko, starring at those reconnaissance photographs in June 1944, understood the implications. The war was already lost. If you find this story had been determined not by tactical brilliance or operational skill or warrior spirit, it helps us by industrial mathematics. In-depth content. Japan had entered a war of attrition with an enemy whose resources were functionally unlimited. Every Japanese carrier sunk represented an irreplaceable loss. Every American carrier sunk would be replaced by 2 more within months. The 24 Essex carriers weren't just ships. They were proof of concept, demonstration that American industrial mobilization exceeded anything the Axis powers could match. They vindicated American strategic planning, validated the decision to fight a 2-ocean war, justified the massive investment in shipyard expansion, worker training, supply chain coordination. They also represented, for Japanese military planners studying them, the clearest possible evidence of inevitable defeat. The story of how these 24 carriers came to exist, how they were designed, built, manned, and employed, reveals the true nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Technology mattered. Tactics mattered. Training mattered. But ultimately, the nation that could build more ships, produce more aircraft, train more pilots, supply more fuel, manufacture more munitions, that nation would prevail. The Essex carriers embodied that truth in 27,000 tons of steel and aluminium. To fully grasp the disparity that Commander Kaneko confronted in those reconnaissance photographs, one must examine not just what America built, but what Japan attempted to build, and why those attempts failed so completely. Japan's carrier aviation history began with promise and innovation. Hosho, commissioned in December 1922, was the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, beating HMS Hermes into service by several months. At 7,400 tons, she was small but represented genuine technological achievement. Her design incorporated lessons from British carrier development, refined by Japanese naval architects, into a functional strike platform. The Washington Naval Treaty, signed that same year, limited carrier tonnage, but allowed Japan to convert 2 incomplete capital ship hulls into carriers. The battlecruiser Akagi and the battleship Kaga, both cancelled under treaty restrictions, were reborn as 27,000-ton fleet carriers. Akagi commissioned in 1927, Kaga in 1928. Both featured unusual 3-deck configurations initially, later modified to single flight deck designs. These conversions gave Japan, along with American carriers Lexington and Saratoga, the largest carriers in the world. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Through the 1930s, Japanese carrier construction continued steadily. Ryojo, a small carrier commissioned in 1933, Soryu 1937, Hiryu 1939. The Shokaku-class sisters, Shokaku and Tsuikaku, both commissioned in 1941 just months before Pearl Harbor, represented Japanese carrier design at its apex. 29,000 tons, speed over 34 knots, capacity for 72 aircraft, excellent armor protection. These were world-class fleet carriers by any standard. By December 1941, Japan possessed 10 fleet and light carriers, the most powerful carrier force in the world. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet, assembled 6 fleet carriers into a single striking force: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Tsuikaku. This concentration of carrier power had no equal. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated their devastating potential, destroying or damaging 8 American battleships, sinking or damaging 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers, destroying 188 aircraft, killing 2,400 Americans, all while losing only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. The victory seemed to validate Japanese carrier doctrine, tactics, training, everything Japanese naval aviation had worked toward. But the triumph contained the seeds of ultimate defeat. The American carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor. They survived to fight, and the attack, rather than breaking American will, unified it. Japan had 6 months to consolidate gains, establish defensive perimeters, exploit resources from conquered territories, before American industrial mobilization produced its effect. Those 6 months saw continued Japanese success. The invasion of the Philippines, Malaya, Dutch East Indies, Burma, the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse by Japanese land-based naval aviation, demonstrating air power's dominance over battleships. The Indian Ocean raid, driving the Royal Navy from Southeast Asian waters. Japanese carrier aviation operated with impunity across vast ocean expanses. Then came the turning point. The Battle of Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942. Japanese intelligence believed only Enterprise and Hornet were available to the Pacific Fleet. Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, was thought out of action, but desperate repairs at Pearl Harbor got Yorktown operational in 72 hours, and she sailed for Midway with her damage control teams still aboard, working on repairs. American code breakers had given Admiral Nimitz complete knowledge of Japanese plans. The 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sailed into an ambush. In 5 minutes of diving attacks by Douglas SBD, dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, 3 Japanese carriers were fatally hit. Akagi, hit by a single bomb that detonated aircraft fuel and munitions on the hangar deck. Kaga, struck by 4 bombs, fires spreading uncontrollably. Soryu, hit by 3 bombs, exploding within minutes. All 3 would sink. Hiryu, launching a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown, was herself found and destroyed that afternoon. 4 fleet carriers gone, 3,000 air crew, maintenance personnel, damage control teams, specialist technicians, all lost. The organizational knowledge, the expertise that made carrier operations possible, sank with the ships. Japan would commission new carriers to replace the losses. What Japan couldn't replace were the men. The Japanese naval aviation training system had produced the world's finest carrier pilots through a process that took years. Candidates underwent rigorous selection, intensive training, continuous evaluation. By Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier pilots averaged 800 flight hours. American carrier pilots averaged 300. This experience translated directly into combat effectiveness. Japanese pilots at Pearl Harbor and during the early months of war demonstrated superior skill in almost every engagement. But the system couldn't scale to wartime demands. Training took too long, required too many resources, produced too few graduates, and every veteran lost in combat was essentially irreplaceable. After Midway, Japanese carrier aviation never regained its elite pilot corps. Replacements rushed through abbreviated training programs, lacked the skill and judgment of pre-war aviators. By the Philippine Sea in June 1944, many Japanese carrier pilots had barely 50 flight hours when launched into combat against American veterans, with hundreds of hours and multiple combat deployments. The Americans, by contrast, had established a training pipeline that produced thousands of qualified pilots annually. Flight schools across the United States, from Pensacola to Corpus Christi to Jacksonville, graduated class after class of naval aviators. Many were killed in combat, but the pipeline kept producing more. The replacement rate exceeded losses. American carrier squadrons in 1944 contained pilots with dozens of missions, hundreds of combat hours, experience that compounded into superior performance. Japan's carrier construction faced similar limitations. The resources existed on paper to build more carriers. The shipyard capacity could theoretically accommodate construction, but theory collapsed against reality. Japan laid down the fleet carrier Taiho in July 1941 at Kawasaki's Kobe shipyard. She was the only fleet carrier laid down that entire year. She represented Japanese carrier design lessons learned from early war experience: armored flight deck to resist bomb damage, enclosed hangar, improved damage control, enhanced anti-aircraft armament. At 29,300 tons, she exceeded Essex in displacement. Her design was excellent. Her construction time was 32 months. USS Essex, laid down just 3 months earlier, commissioned in 20 months. USS Franklin, arguably the fastest warship construction of the war, completed in 14 months. The Americans built carriers faster because their shipyards possessed superior infrastructure, their workers had greater productivity, their supply chains delivered components on schedule, their methods emphasized speed without sacrificing quality. Taiho finally commissioned in March 1944. She joined the mobile fleet for the Philippine Sea operation, the largest carrier force Japan would assemble since Midway. 3 months later, on June 19, 1944, the first day of the battle, the American submarine USS Albacore torpedoed her. A single torpedo strike, hitting forward. The damage seemed manageable initially, but poor damage control decisions, inadequate ventilation management, fuel vapor accumulation, led to a massive internal explosion hours later. Taiho rolled over and sank, taking 1,260 men with her. She had been operational for exactly 3 months. Japan's sole purpose-built wartime fleet carrier lasted 1 battle. The remaining Japanese carrier construction program revealed the desperation of a nation whose industrial capacity couldn't match requirements. After Midway, Japanese planners authorized conversion programs to rapidly increase carrier numbers. The seaplane tenders Chitose and Chiyoda converted to light carriers. The submarine depot ships Tsuiho, Ryuho, and Shoho converted to light carriers. The ocean liners Junyo, Hio, and Taiyo converted to auxiliary carriers. These conversions added numbers, but not capability. The converted carriers were slower, carried fewer aircraft, possessed minimal armor protection, lacked the sophisticated damage control systems of purpose-built fleet carriers. They could fill gaps in operational deployment, but couldn't replace the fleet carriers lost at Midway and subsequent battles. The most ambitious conversion program targeted the third Yamato-class battleship hull. Shinano, laid down in May 1940 as a 70,000-ton battleship, was redesignated for carrier conversion after Midway. The conversion took over 2 years. Shinano commissioned in November 1944 as the largest carrier in the world, 69,000 tons fully loaded. Her aircraft capacity, however, was only 47 operational aircraft, pathetically small for her enormous size. Japanese planners had reconceived her role during construction, not as a strike carrier but as a mobile support platform for other carriers, carrying reserve aircraft, providing repair facilities, serving as a floating depot. The design compromises this imposed, combined with rushed construction and incomplete training for her crew, made her operationally limited. 10 days after commissioning, while conducting her shakedown cruise from Yokosuka to Kure, Shinano was detected by the American submarine USS Archerfish. Captain Joseph Enright tracked her through the night, maneuvered ahead, and fired 6 torpedoes. 4 hit. The damage was serious but not immediately fatal. Shinano's armored flight deck and subdivision into watertight compartments should have allowed her to survive, but her crew, inadequately trained, made critical errors in damage control. Watertight doors had been left open, pumping systems were mismanaged. Water spread through interior spaces. 7 hours after the torpedo hits, Shinano capsized and sank, taking 1,435 crew members to the bottom. The world's largest carrier, 10 days in service, sunk by a submarine 1/46th her displacement. The loss epitomized Japanese carrier aviation's trajectory: technically sophisticated ships, inadequately manned, insufficiently supported, facing an enemy whose resources and capabilities exceeded anything Japanese planning had anticipated. By late 1944, Japan's carrier construction program existed only on paper. The Unryu class, a simplified fleet carrier design based on pre-war Hiryu, was intended for mass production. Plans called for 16 ships. 3 were completed. Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi, all commissioned in autumn 1944. Unryu was torpedoed and sunk 1 month after commissioning during her first operational mission. Amagi and Katsuragi survived the war only because they remained in port, lacking fuel for operations, lacking aircraft to embark, lacking trained pilots to fly those non-existent aircraft. The remaining 13 Unryu-class carriers were cancelled, some while under construction, because Japan lacked the resources to complete them. Steel shortages, power plant shortages, the turbine engines intended for carriers diverted to other urgent requirements. Worker shortages, as conscription pulled skilled labourers into military service. Bombing raids, B-29 raids against Japanese industrial centres, disrupting production schedules. And, most critically, the complete collapse of resource imports as American submarines achieved maritime dominance. By mid-1945, Japanese merchant shipping had been essentially annihilated. American submarines, using improved torpedoes, better tactics, excellent intelligence, sank over 1,000 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling nearly 5 million tons, the tankers bringing oil from the Dutch East Indies, the ore carriers bringing iron and bauxite from Southeast Asia, the freighters bringing food, coal, rubber, every commodity an island nation required. All fell victim to American submarines operating with near impunity through Japanese home waters. Without oil, Japanese industry halted. Without steel, shipyards closed. Without aluminum, aircraft production stopped. The carriers that Japan theoretically could build became impossible to build because the materials simply didn't exist. The final tally tells the complete story. Japan built or converted 25 aircraft carriers throughout its entire history. Of these, 18 were commissioned during the war years from 1937 to 1945. This represents extraordinary effort by a nation with limited resources facing multiple competing demands. But 18 carriers over 8 years meant slightly more than 2 per year on average, and this average concealed reality. Most Japanese carriers were conversions rather than purpose-built ships, compromising their effectiveness. The Americans built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers in 4 years, from 1942 to 1945, an average of 6 per year, all purpose-built to standardized specifications. They also built 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, completed in 1943. They built over 100 escort carriers, smaller and slower, but capable of anti-submarine warfare, convoy protection, amphibious support. The American total approached 150 carriers of all types commissioned during the war years. This disparity, more than any tactical innovation or operational brilliance or technological breakthrough, determined the Pacific War's outcome. Japan entered the war with qualitative superiority in carrier aviation, better trained pilots, superior tactics, battle-tested experience. Within 2 years, American quantitative superiority overwhelmed Japanese quality. More carriers meant more, aircraft meant more sorties, meant more bombs dropped, meant more targets destroyed. The mathematics compounded relentlessly. By July 1945, when American carrier aircraft struck the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy at Kura Naval Base, the disparity had reached its apex. Task Force 38 operated 15 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers. The aircraft launched from these carriers struck every remaining Japanese warship in home waters. Of 25 Japanese carriers built throughout history, only 5 survived to August 1945, all damaged, all non-operational, all awaiting final destruction from B-29 raids or naval bombardment. The Essex carriers that delivered this destruction embodied American industrial supremacy. USS Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, had participated in operations from the Gilbert Islands through the final strikes on Japan. USS Lexington, named for the carrier lost at Coral Sea, had operated continuously since 1943, earning the nickname the Blue Ghost because Japanese propaganda repeatedly announced her sinking. USS Intrepid survived 4 kamikaze hits and a torpedo strike, repaired each time, returned to action each time. USS Essex herself, the class leader, participated in virtually every major Pacific operation from 1943 forward. These ships weren't invulnerable. Several Essex carriers suffered severe damage from kamikazes, bombs, torpedoes. USS Franklin, hit by 2 bombs off the Japanese coast in March 1945, suffered catastrophic fires that killed 807 men, the worst single-ship casualty total in American naval history. But Franklin survived, towed to safety, later repaired. USS Bunker Hill, hit by 2 kamikazes in rapid succession off Okinawa in May 1945, lost 396 men and burned for hours. But Bunker Hill survived, her damage control teams preventing the ship's loss. The ability to absorb damage and survive reflected sophisticated design, but also reflected American logistics. Damage that would have forced a Japanese carrier to return to Japan for months of repairs could be addressed by repair ships at forward anchorages in weeks. The Americans maintained floating dry docks, repair vessels, supply ships, hospital ships, all forward deployed to support carrier operations. This logistics train enabled sustained operations at combat tempo impossible for Japan to match. Japanese carriers that survived damage faced crippling delays. Shokaku, damaged at Coral Sea in May 1942, required 3 months of repairs before returning to service. Tsuikaku, damaged at Santa Cruz in October 1942, needed months of repair. Every major repair meant a return to Japanese home waters, time in dry dock, time away from operations. The Americans repaired carriers at Ulithi, at Manus, at forward bases with full facilities. The operational tempo remained constant because damaged ships were quickly replaced or quickly repaired. This contrast in sustainability reveals a truth about modern warfare that Japanese planners understood too late. Industrial capacity isn't measured solely by production numbers. It's measured by the entire system: production, logistics, maintenance, training, replacement, all coordinated into sustained operational capability. America possessed this system at scale. Japan did not and could not develop it quickly enough to matter. When Commander Kaneko counted those 24 Essex carriers in reconnaissance photographs, he was counting more than ships. He was quantifying a system that Japan couldn't match. Each carrier represented a steel mill producing armor plate, a power plant manufacturing turbines, an electronics factory building radar sets, an aviation fuel refinery producing 100-octane gasoline, a training command graduating pilots, a logistics system delivering supplies, all coordinated across a continental nation with resources that seemed limitless. From Japanese perspective, the realization was crushing. Japan had initiated war against an enemy that could quite literally build more military equipment than Japan could sink, shoot down, or destroy. The war wasn't unwinnable because Japanese tactics were inferior, or Japanese soldiers lacked courage, or Japanese technology lagged behind. The war was unwinnable because the arithmetic didn't balance. American production exceeded Japanese consumption of American equipment. Every ship Japan sank was replaced by 2 more. Every aircraft Japan shot down was replaced by 5 more. Every pilot Japan killed was replaced by 10 more. This mathematical certainty existed from December 1941 forward, but Japanese leadership refused to acknowledge it. Cultural factors played roles. The emphasis on spirit over material, the belief in qualitative superiority, compensating for quantitative inferiority, the conviction that American will would break before Japanese will, all proved false. American resolve strengthened with every battle. American material superiority compounded with every production quarter. American operational capabilities improved through experience, while Japanese capabilities deteriorated through attrition. By June 1944, when those reconnaissance photographs documented 24 Essex carriers, the war was effectively over. Japan fought on for another 14 months, but the outcome had been determined by industrial mathematics. The Essex carriers would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. their aircraft striking airfields, factories, shipping, infrastructure. The carriers would support the invasion of Okinawa, the closest Japanese territory to the home islands. The carriers would have supported the invasion of Kyushu and Honshu if those operations had been necessary. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war without invasion. But make no mistake, if invasion had been required, the Essex carriers would have provided air support. By war's end, American planning projected using 42 carriers, including British Pacific Fleet carriers, for the invasion of Japan, 42 carriers delivering thousands of sorties daily, suppressing Japanese defences, supporting landing forces, interdicting reinforcements. Japan had no answer. The 4 surviving carriers possessed no aircraft, no fuel, no trained pilots. They sat at anchor, waiting for destruction that came from B-29 raids, rather than carrier strikes, only because the carriers had more important targets. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which began the war as the world's most powerful carrier force, ended it with 4 damaged hulks awaiting scrapping. The human cost of this industrial disparity extended far beyond ships lost and battles fought. It manifested in decisions made by Japanese commanders who understood the mathematical impossibility of their situation yet continued fighting because surrender was culturally unthinkable and strategically forbidden. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who conceived the kamikaze tactics in October 1944, understood that conventional naval aviation could no longer contest American carrier supremacy. The loss of trained pilots at the Philippine Sea, combined with the continuing flood of American carriers, made traditional aerial combat futile. Japanese pilots, many with minimal training, flying obsolescent aircraft, facing American pilots with hundreds of combat hours flying superior machines, died in numbers that shocked even hardened commanders. The kamikaze represented Japan's adaptation to industrial inferiority. If Japanese pilots couldn't survive combat encounters with American fighters, if Japanese aircraft couldn't penetrate American defensive screens through skill and tactics, then transform the pilot and aircraft into a guided weapon. 1 plane, 1 pilot, 1 ship. The mathematics seemed favorable. Kamikaze aircraft were cheap compared to carriers. Barely trained pilots could aim at a stationary target. The psychological impact might force American withdrawal. Over 1,300 kamikaze sorties struck American ships during the Okinawa campaign alone, from April through June 1945. They sank dozens of destroyers and smaller vessels. They damaged numerous carriers, battleships, cruisers. USS Bunker Hill, USS Franklin, USS Intrepid, USS Enterprise, all suffered kamikaze damage. The attacks killed thousands of American sailors, wounded thousands more, tested American morale and resolve. But they didn't stop the carriers. The Essex-class design incorporated lessons from early war carrier losses. Armor protection around aviation fuel storage, magazines, machinery spaces limited damage from hits. Subdivision into compartments prevented flooding from spreading. Multiple fire suppression systems contained blazes. Damage control training emphasized rapid response to casualties. These features, combined with excellent crew training, enabled Essex carriers to absorb multiple kamikaze hits and remain operational or survive for later repair. USS Franklin, hit by 2 bombs that triggered secondary explosions killing 807 men, was saved by her crew's damage control efforts. The ship lost propulsion, listed severely, burned for hours, but survived through sheer determination and excellent design. She reached Pearl Harbor under her own power after temporary repairs at Ulithi. USS Bunker Hill, struck by 2 kamikazes in 30 seconds, suffered similar catastrophic damage and similar casualties, yet survived. These ships proved that while kamikazes could inflict terrible damage, they couldn't sink Essex carriers, except through extraordinary luck, and every damaged carrier was eventually repaired and returned to service, or replaced by another from the construction pipeline. USS Intrepid suffered 5 kamikaze hits over the course of the war. She was repaired after each one and returned to operations. The Japanese expended hundreds of aircraft and hundreds of pilots trying to stop the American carrier advance. The Americans lost ships and men but maintained operational tempo because replacement capacity exceeded losses. The kamikaze campaign failed strategically because it couldn't overcome American industrial capacity. To stop American operations required sinking or crippling carriers faster than American shipyards could build or repair them. This proved impossible. The Americans commissioned new Essex carriers throughout 1945, even as damaged carriers underwent repair. USS Bonhomme Richard joined the fleet in time for the final strikes on Japan. USS Boxer commissioned in April 1945. USS Lake Champlain, USS Tarawa. Others reached operational status as the war neared its end. Japanese intelligence tracked this continuing production with despair. The reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports documented a building program that showed no signs of slowing. By mid-1945, American shipyards were completing one Essex carrier every 6 weeks on average. Plans existed for additional construction beyond the 24 completed units. Orders had been placed for 8 more Essex carriers before cancellations came after the war ended. From Japanese perspective, the Americans possessed unlimited carriers. Every strike destroyed Japanese facilities, sank Japanese ships, killed Japanese personnel, and then the American carriers would withdraw to replenish and return weeks later for another strike. The cycle repeated endlessly because American logistics supported it. Japanese capability to resist eroded steadily because Japanese resources were finite and dwindling. The final American carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands in July and August 1945 demonstrated this overwhelming superiority. Task Force 38 operated freely in Japanese waters, launching multiple strikes daily. The carriers struck every remaining Japanese warship at anchor. The battleship Nagato, survivor of Pearl Harbor and Midway, bombed until she settled in shallow water. The carrier Amagi capsized at Kura by bomb damage. The carrier Katsuragi hit multiple times, burned but remained afloat. The hybrid battleship carriers Isa and Hyuga, converted after Midway to carry aircraft but never effectively operational as carriers, bombed into uselessness. American carrier aircraft ranged across the Japanese home islands, attacking railways, factories, airfields, ports. The strikes complemented B-29 raids, together reducing Japanese infrastructure to ruins. The Americans encountered minimal aerial opposition because Japanese aircraft were being conserved for the anticipated invasion. The few Japanese fighters that did engage were overwhelmed by American numbers and pilot skill. These final operations showcased what American carrier aviation had become by war's end. The tactics that had been experimental in 1942 were now standardized doctrine. The carriers operated in task groups of 3 or 4, each task group a balanced force with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The carriers coordinated their strikes to saturate defenses, overwhelming anti-aircraft fire through sheer numbers. Fighter sweeps arrived first to suppress airfields and establish air superiority. Bombers followed to strike assigned targets. The whole process moved with practiced efficiency, sortie rates reaching levels unimaginable earlier in the war. Japanese commanders watching these strikes understood their helplessness. They possessed no capability to contest American control of the air or sea. The surviving carriers sat at anchor unable to operate. The remaining aircraft waited in hidden bases for an invasion that might never come. The troops ashore prepared for battles they knew they couldn't win. All awaited the inevitable conclusion of a war that had been lost not in tactical defeats, but in the fundamental arithmetic of industrial capacity. The realization that 24 Essex carriers equaled Japan's entire historical carrier production captured this truth perfectly. It wasn't that Japanese naval architects were incompetent, or Japanese shipyard workers were lazy, or Japanese materials were inferior. Japanese carrier design was excellent. Japanese construction quality was high. Japanese naval personnel were skilled and dedicated. None of it mattered against an enemy who could build carriers as fast as an automobile manufacturer builds cars, using similar mass production techniques, similar standardization, similar industrial organization. American victory in the Pacific resulted from many factors: superior code breaking, better tactics, excellent training, technological innovation, operational flexibility. But undergirding all these factors was industrial capacity so vast that it simply overwhelmed Japanese resources. The 24 Essex carriers symbolized this capacity. They were the visible manifestation of American economic power translated into military force. Each carrier had cost approximately $70 million to build, about $1 billion in modern currency. 24 carriers represented an investment of roughly 24 billion current dollars, just for the ships themselves, not including aircraft, personnel costs, logistics support, maintenance, or operations. Japan's entire gross domestic product in 1944 was roughly 40 billion current dollars. The Americans spent half of Japan's GDP building one class of carrier, while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war, supporting allies, building hundreds of other warship types, producing hundreds of thousands of aircraft, training millions of personnel. This disparity defined the Pacific War more than any other single factor. Japanese planners in 1941 believed that American wealth would prove irrelevant if Japan could establish defensive positions quickly and make their reduction sufficiently costly. They assumed American public opinion would demand peace rather than pay the blood price for Pacific reconquest. Both assumptions failed catastrophically. American public opinion never wavered in supporting total victory. American industrial capacity proved relevant precisely because it could sustain operations at any cost level Japan could inflict. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 provided Japan's leadership with a face-saving reason to surrender. The emperor's announcement cited a new and most cruel bomb as justification for accepting defeat. But informed Japanese military leaders knew the war was already lost before the atomic bombs fell. They had known since at least mid-1944, when the disparity in carrier numbers became undeniable. Commander Kaneko, who counted those 24 Essex carriers in reconnaissance photographs, survived the war. In post-war interviews, he described the moment of realization when he compared American carrier construction to Japan's entire historical production. He understood immediately that the numbers made continued war senseless. One nation had built as many carriers in 3 years as another had built in 25 years. The implications were inescapable. Other Japanese officers reached similar conclusions through different paths. Submarine officers watching American task forces grew to recognize specific carriers by their characteristics, noting with dismay when carriers they had reported damaged or sunk reappeared weeks later fully operational. Surface fleet officers, conducting their last desperate sorties in 1945, sailed knowing American carriers would locate and destroy them because American radar, American reconnaissance, American intelligence provided complete battlefield awareness. The Japanese government officially surrendered on August 15, 1945. The surrender ceremony occurred September 2 aboard USS Missouri, a battleship, in Tokyo Bay. The symbolism was deliberate. American battleships had been shattered at Pearl Harbor. Their seeming obsolescence in the age of carrier aviation made them natural symbols of American vulnerability. Yet Missouri and her sisters had been built during the war years, commissioned, deployed, and now served as the stage for accepting Japanese surrender. But the true symbols of American naval victory weren't present at the surrender ceremony. The Essex carriers were operating at sea, prepared for any last-minute Japanese treachery, ready to launch strikes if the surrender collapsed. They remained at sea because their presence guaranteed American dominance, their aircraft providing security over the surrender ceremonies, their capability to strike ensuring Japanese compliance. In the years following the war, many of these Essex carriers continued serving. They underwent modifications to operate jet aircraft. They participated in the Korean War, Vietnam War, served as training carriers, eventually as anti-submarine warfare platforms. USS Lexington, commissioned in 1943, continued operations until 1991, 48 years of continuous service, a longevity record for aircraft carriers. Several Essex carriers became museum ships, preserved as monuments to American naval aviation: USS Yorktown in Charleston, USS Intrepid. In New York, USS Hornet. In California, USS Lexington in Texas. These museum ships allow modern visitors to walk the decks where thousands of sailors served, where hundreds of aircraft launched into combat, where American naval power reached its zenith. Standing on their flight decks, one can visualize the scale of operations they supported. Imagining 24 such ships operating simultaneously across the Pacific provides perspective on the industrial achievement they represented. For Japan, the lesson proved profound and lasting. Post-war Japanese policy embraced economic development over military power, recognizing that industrial capacity determines modern conflicts. The nation that couldn't match American carrier production in the 1940s became an economic powerhouse in the following decades. Through focus on manufacturing, efficiency, quality control, technological innovation, the skills that had gone into building 25 carriers were redirected into building automobiles, electronics, machinery, consumer goods. Japan transformed from defeated power to economic giant through emphasis on industrial capacity rather than military force. The Maritime Self-Defense Force that eventually emerged operated under strict constitutional limitations. For decades, Japan built no aircraft carriers. Only in the 21st century did Japan commission helicopter carriers nominally for defensive purposes, though capable of modification to operate fixed-wing aircraft. The historical memory of carrier warfare, the understanding of the resources required, and the vulnerabilities created, shaped Japanese naval policy for 75 years. The story of 24 Essex carriers, equaling Japan's entire carrier production history, endures because it captures a fundamental truth about industrial warfare. Technology matters, training matters, tactics matter, but sustained military operations require industrial foundations, supply chains, logistics networks, manufacturing capacity, resource access, all integrated into systems, capable of supporting forces in combat over extended periods at any loss rate the enemy can impose. Japan entered the war with qualitative superiority in carrier aviation and lost because American quantitative superiority proved overwhelming. The Americans didn't build better carriers initially. They built more carriers, more aircraft, trained more pilots, produced more fuel, manufactured more munitions, created logistics systems capable of sustaining operations at tempos Japan couldn't match. The disparity wasn't subtle or debatable. 24 Essex carriers versus 25 total Japanese carriers across all history stated the mathematical reality with perfect clarity. Commander Kaneko, starring at those reconnaissance photographs in June 1944, understood this truth immediately. Many of his colleagues reached similar understanding through their own experiences. Some senior leaders refused to acknowledge reality, continuing to speak of fighting spirit and decisive battles, but informed officers knew the war was already lost. The 24 Essex carriers thus represent not just American naval achievement, but also the decisive role of industrial capacity in modern warfare. They vindicated the American strategic approach of relying on economic strength, validated the decision to prioritize production over conserving resources, demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize for total war as effectively as authoritarian regimes. They also serve as cautionary reminder of the costs of military miscalculation. Japanese leadership in 1941 made strategic decisions based on flawed assumptions about American industrial capacity, public will, and strategic priorities. These errors cost Japan millions of lives, the destruction of its cities, the loss of its empire, occupation by foreign forces. The 24 Essex carriers were instruments of that defeat, symbols of the opponent Japan had chosen to fight and couldn't overcome. Standing today in the museum that preserves USS Intrepid in New York Harbor, or USS Yorktown in Charleston Harbor, visitors can reflect on these ships' role in history. They weren't just weapons platforms, they were proof of concept, demonstrations that American industrial mobilization could produce military force on scales previously unimaginable. They established patterns that would define American military power for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The projection of force through carrier strike groups, the reliance on technological superiority, the assumption of resource availability, the expectation of industrial capacity to support extended operations globally. The Japanese intelligence officers who counted these ships in 1944 understood they were counting not just carriers, but the evidence of Japan's inevitable defeat. 24 Essex carriers by mid-1945. Japan had built 25 total carriers throughout its entire history. The mathematics was devastating. The implications were inescapable. The outcome was certain. This is their documented story. Verified through reconnaissance photographs, construction records, naval archives, and the testimony of officers who witnessed the disparity firsthand and understood its meaning. It demonstrates that in modern warfare, industrial capacity often determines outcomes more decisively than tactical brilliance or operational skill or technological innovation. The nation that can build more ships, produce more aircraft, train more personnel, sustain operations longer, that nation possesses fundamental advantages that tactical excellence cannot overcome. The 24 Essex carriers stand as permanent testament to this truth. Monuments in steel to American industrial power at its peak, and silent proof that Japan's war was lost not in tactical defeats, but in the basic arithmetic of production capacity that couldn't match American manufacturing might. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.